In 2015, the world celebrated. For the first time in more than a decade of standoffs, threats, and near catastrophes, Iran and 6 of the world's most powerful nations sat down, signed an agreement, and shook hands. They called it a historic deal, a turning point, the beginning of the end of one of the most dangerous standoffs of the 21st century. 3 years later, the United States walked away. And now, as Iran's nuclear program has advanced further than at any point in its history, the question that haunts every intelligence agency, every foreign ministry, every capital city from Washington to Tel Aviv to Riyadh is simple. Is there any diplomatic solution left? The story of Iran's nuclear program does not begin with the Islamic Revolution. It does not begin with Ayatollah Khomeini, or with sanctions, or with centrifuges spinning beneath mountains of rock. It begins in 1957, with the United States of America. Under President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative, Washington gifted Iran's Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, with a research reactor and technical assistance to build a civilian nuclear infrastructure. The Shah was a loyal ally, a bulwark against Soviet influence, and, in Washington's calculation, a modernizing Iran, one with nuclear power, with universities, with industrial capacity, was a stable Iran. By 1967, the United States had supplied a 5-megawatt research reactor to Tehran University. Iran joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. By the mid-1970s, the Shah had announced plans for 23 nuclear power stations. Western companies lined up. American, French, German firms competed for contracts. Billions changed hands. The atom would be Iran's future. Then came 1979. The Islamic Revolution swept away the Shah, expelled Western contractors, and installed a theocratic government that declared America the Great Satan and Israel the Little Satan. But here is the detail that changes everything. Ayatollah Khomeini initially stopped the nuclear program. He called it un-Islamic, a symbol of Western decadence. That did not last long. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces invaded Iran. What followed was 8 years of industrial-scale slaughter, the longest conventional war of the 20th century. Iraq used chemical weapons, nerve agents, mustard gas, on Iranian soldiers, on Iranian civilians, on entire Kurdish villages. The West largely looked away. Some actively helped Saddam. The lesson Iran's leadership drew from those 8 years was searing and permanent. Iran was alone. No ally would protect it. No international norm would shield it. The only deterrent that truly worked, the only guarantee of survival, was the kind of weapon that made invasion unthinkable. The nuclear program was quietly restarted, this time with a different purpose in mind. For years, Iran's nuclear program existed in a gray zone, officially civilian, covertly advancing. The International Atomic Energy Agency monitored declared facilities, but Iran had undeclared ones. In August 2002, an Iranian opposition group held a press conference in Washington, D.C., and blew the lid off 2 secret facilities: a uranium enrichment plant at Natanz and a heavy water reactor under construction at Arak. The world had been lied to. The IAEA launched inspections. What they found was a sophisticated, far more advanced program than anyone had publicly admitted. Centrifuge cascades, laser enrichment experiments, traces of highly enriched uranium. The confrontation that would define the next 2 decades had begun. The United States under George W. Bush was consumed by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The last thing Washington wanted was a third front in the Middle East. But someone had to confront Tehran's nuclear ambitions. In 2003, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, the so-called EU3, stepped forward. They offered something Washington wouldn't: direct negotiation. The talks produced a temporary freeze on uranium enrichment. Iran suspended its program in exchange for economic incentives and a promise that its right to peaceful nuclear energy would be respected. It lasted 2 years. In 2005, a hardliner named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president of Iran. Within months, Iran had resumed enrichment. The EU3 talks collapsed. When diplomacy stalled, the West turned to other tools. The United Nations Security Council passed 6 resolutions demanding Iran suspend enrichment. When Iran refused, the United States and European Union escalated to sweeping economic sanctions, targeting the banking system, the oil industry, and the Revolutionary Guard's commercial empire. By 2012, Iran's economy had contracted by 12%. The rial had lost 2/3 of its value. Inflation was spiraling. Ordinary Iranians, not the regime, bore the heaviest cost. But sanctions alone were not enough. In 2010, a computer worm called Stuxnet, jointly developed by the United States and Israel, though never officially acknowledged, infected the control systems of centrifuges at Natanz. Centrifuges began spinning too fast. Then they tore themselves apart. Iran lost roughly 1,000 machines. The program was set back by an estimated 18 months to 2 years. A shadow war had also begun. Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated on the streets of Tehran. Motorcycle-borne gunmen, magnetic bombs attached to car doors. Israel denied involvement. The scientists died anyway. 5 scientists killed between 2010 and 2012. Messages sent, programs delayed. The diplomatic track and the covert track were running in parallel and sometimes colliding. By 2013, both sides were quietly exhausted. Iran's economy was crippled. Its isolation was total. And despite all the centrifuges spinning underground, Tehran had not crossed the final line, had not actually built a weapon. The question was, could a deal prevent it from ever doing so? Barack Obama thought yes. He had campaigned on engagement. He believed that the logic of perpetual confrontation produced only more confrontation. Iran's new president, Hassan Rouhani, had been elected on a platform of pragmatism. He was not a reformer in the Western sense. He was a regime insider. But he understood that sanctions were destroying the country he governed. In September 2013, on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, Obama and Rouhani spoke by telephone. It was the first direct contact between an American and Iranian leader since the hostage crisis of 1979. The call lasted 15 minutes. Behind the scenes, an American back channel had already been running for months in Oman, organized by the Sultan of Muscat, with teams of senior American officials meeting quietly with Iranian counterparts. The work was patient, painstaking, and deeply secret. A deal was already taking shape. 18 days of negotiations, sleepless nights, delegations who had barely spoken to each other for 30 years, now arguing over decimal points and centrifuge counts and the precise wording of a paragraph. On July 14, 2015, in Vienna, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was announced. The P5+1, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany, had reached an agreement with Iran. Secretary of State John Kerry, who had personally led the American delegation, stood before the world with a walking cane, having broken his leg in a cycling accident weeks before, and described the moment as a fundamental turning point. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif had tears in his eyes. The JCPOA was not a peace treaty. It was not normalization. It was a highly specific, technically detailed nuclear agreement. and it is important to understand precisely what it did and did not cover. What Iran agreed to: reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium by 98%, limit uranium enrichment to 3.67%, far below weapons grade, cap the number of operating centrifuges at roughly 5,000, with the rest mothballed, redesign the Iraq heavy water reactor so it could not produce weapons-grade plutonium, accept the most intrusive international inspection regime in history. In return, the international community agreed to lift economic sanctions. Billions of dollars frozen in overseas accounts would be released. Iran could rejoin the global banking system. Oil exports would resume. The economic siege would end. The IAEA would have access to declared and suspicious sites, with a mechanism for requesting access to undeclared locations. These restrictions would last between 10 and 15 years, the so-called sunset clauses. Critics said this was a fatal flaw. Proponents said it was the only realistic deal available. The deal had an unspoken logic. Give Iran economic relief now, integrate Iran into the global economy, and over 15 years, alter the cost-benefit calculations so profoundly that returning to a weapons program became unthinkable. It was a bet on time, and it rested on one assumption above all others, that the United States would keep its word.
From the moment the deal was announced, it was under attack. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a historic mistake. He had already addressed a joint session of the United States Congress against the wishes of the Obama administration, to argue against any deal that left Iran with any nuclear infrastructure whatsoever. In Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states watched with mounting alarm. A deal that legitimized Iran, released its frozen funds, and lifted its isolation was not a solution to their problems. It was a new problem. In the United States Senate and House, Republican opposition was fierce. Critics argued the deal was too weak, the inspections inadequate, the sunset clauses suicidal. Congress passed legislation requiring a review period, though ultimately lacking the votes to kill the deal outright. And within Iran itself, the Revolutionary Guard, the hardliners, the supreme leader's inner circle, many regarded Zarif's deal with deep suspicion. They had not fought a revolution and survived 8 years of war to become acceptable to America. The deal had survived, but the forces aligned against it were patient, and they had a candidate.
On May 8, 2018, President Donald Trump stood before cameras and announced that the United States was withdrawing from the JCPOA. He called it the worst deal ever negotiated, a disaster, a laughingstock. He described it as one-sided, expiring, and deliberately weak. A deal that didn't cover Iran's ballistic missile program, its regional proxy activities, or its human rights record. He signed the withdrawal. Sanctions were not just restored, they were expanded. Maximum pressure was the new strategy. The goal, the administration insisted, was not to destroy Iran. It was to force a better deal, one that covered everything the JCPOA had left untouched. Iran's position: there would be no renegotiation. The deal had been made. If America abandoned it, Iran would respond. The economic consequences for Iran were immediate and severe. The reimposition of American sanctions triggered what economists called secondary sanctions. Any foreign company doing business with Iran faced losing access to the American market. European companies, one by one, abandoned Iranian deals they had just signed. Airbus contracts for civilian aircraft canceled. Oil companies withdrew. European banks quietly stepped back. European governments were furious. They had kept their end of the deal. They insisted it was working. They scrambled to create financial mechanisms to allow trade with Iran outside the dollar system. It didn't work. The mechanisms were too small, too slow, too vulnerable. Iran watched for a year. It stayed inside the deal even after America left, hoping Europe could deliver the economic relief it had been promised. When it became clear Europe could not, Iran began methodically breaking the deal's limits. First, it exceeded the enriched uranium stockpile limit. Then it surpassed the enrichment level cap. Then it installed advanced centrifuges the deal had prohibited. Then it restricted IAEA inspector access. Each step was announced publicly. Each was framed as a measured, reversible response to American aggression. Each step was also, irreversibly, a step forward. On January 3, 2020, an American drone strike killed General Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad International Airport. Soleimani was the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quds Force, the most powerful military figure in Iran after the supreme leader. For Iran's government, it was not just a military strike. It was an execution, a declaration of the terms by which America would fight. Iran responded with ballistic missile strikes on American bases in Iraq. No Americans were killed. The response was calibrated to avoid triggering a full-scale war. But Iran also announced it would no longer respect any limit on uranium enrichment. The JCPOA's central constraint, a 3.67% enrichment ceiling, was gone. Iran began enriching to 20%, then 60%. Then, in 2023, traces of uranium enriched to 84% were detected at a facility 1 percentage point away from weapons grade. The IAEA's Director General described the situation as deeply troubling. The agency reported it could no longer provide assurances about the peaceful nature of Iran's program. Iran had more enriched uranium stockpiled and enriched to higher levels than at any point in its history. When Joe Biden won the American presidency in November 2020, the diplomatic path seemed to reopen. Biden had been vice president when the JCPOA was signed. He believed America should return to it. He said so repeatedly before and after the election. The United States would rejoin the deal if Iran returned to compliance, and then both sides would negotiate longer and stronger terms. Talks resumed in Vienna in April 2021. The talks were indirect. Iran refused to sit across a table from American diplomats, still refusing to acknowledge the United States as a legitimate interlocutor after the Trump withdrawal. European mediators shuttled between the delegations in separate rooms. By early 2022, a deal was reportedly within reach. Draft text had been finalized. A return to compliance was described as days away. Then it stalled. The sticking point was the designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, a designation Trump had imposed. Iran demanded it be lifted as part of any deal. The Biden administration, facing fierce domestic opposition, refused. The deal that was days away slipped back into weeks, then months. By 2022, hardliner Ibrahim Raisi was president of Iran. The pragmatist Zarif was gone. Iran's negotiating posture hardened. In September 2022, a 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman named Mahsa Amini died in the custody of Iran's morality police, having been arrested for allegedly improperly wearing her hijab. What followed was the largest wave of protests Iran had seen since 1979. Woman, life, freedom became the slogan. Millions took to the streets. Young women burned their hijabs. Men stood beside them. The regime responded with violence. Hundreds were killed, thousands arrested. Executions followed. For Western governments, the moment made returning to a nuclear deal politically radioactive. How could European leaders sell the JCPOA revival to their publics
while simultaneously watching Iranian security forces shoot protesters in the streets. The Vienna talks were suspended. They have not formally resumed. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a massive terror attack on Israel. 1,500 Israelis were killed, over 200 taken hostage. Iran did not formally direct the attack. That remains disputed. But Hamas is an Iranian-funded, Iranian-armed proxy. The attack fits squarely into Iran's regional strategy. Maintain permanent pressure on Israel through the so-called axis of resistance, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria. What followed reshaped the entire regional chessboard. Israel launched a devastation of Gaza. Hezbollah and Israel traded fire across the Lebanese border for months before full-scale war erupted in late 2024. Israeli operations inside Iran, strikes on air defense systems, assassinations of senior IRGC commanders, the killing of Hamas's political chief in Tehran brought the two countries closer to direct war than ever before. Iran fired hundreds of missiles and drones directly at Israel, twice, in what it described as defensive responses. In this environment, with Israel and Iran trading direct strikes, with American and Iranian proxies in kinetic conflict across three countries, with Gaza in ruins and Lebanon devastated, the idea of returning to a quiet diplomatic negotiation in a Vienna hotel felt not just unlikely, but almost absurd. By 2025, Iran's nuclear program had achieved what no previous IAEA report had ever stated so plainly. Iran possessed enough highly enriched uranium to produce, if it chose to, sufficient fissile material for several nuclear weapons within a matter of weeks. This is called breakout time. The time needed to produce enough weapons-grade fissile material for a bomb once the decision is made. Under the JCPOA, that breakout time had been stretched to 12 months. Without the deal, it had compressed to days or weeks. Experts caution that possessing fissile material is not the same as possessing a deliverable nuclear weapon. Weaponization, creating a device compact enough to fit in a warhead, testing it, integrating it with a delivery system, takes additional time and involves additional detectable activities. Iran has reportedly not crossed those remaining lines. The supreme leader has maintained a fatwa, a religious ruling, against nuclear weapons. How reliable that line remains is the question that keeps intelligence analysts awake at night. In January 2025, Donald Trump returned to the White House for a second term. His approach to Iran picked up where it had left off and escalated. Maximum pressure 2.0. New and expanded sanctions. Direct threats of military action if Iran attempted to weaponize its nuclear program. Simultaneously and somewhat contradictorily, his administration signaled it was open to a new deal, but only on American terms, covering the full range of Iranian behavior from nuclear to ballistic missiles to regional proxies. Reports in early 2025 described back-channel communications between Washington and Tehran, Omani intermediaries again, reportedly carrying messages from Trump to Khamenei. The offer? Negotiate or face the consequences. Iran's response was characteristic. Neither acceptance nor outright rejection, but continued enrichment, continued opacity, and continued waiting. The game of nuclear brinkmanship continued. Israel has never accepted the proposition that a diplomatic solution, any diplomatic solution, is sufficient. The Israeli position, stated and unstated, has been consistent for decades. A nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat, and existential threats cannot be managed. They must be eliminated.
Israel conducted covert operations against Iran's nuclear program for years. Stuxnet, assassinations, sabotage. In 2024, Israeli strikes inside Iran targeted air defense systems specifically protecting nuclear facilities, widely interpreted as a rehearsal, a demonstration, a warning. The question of whether Israel would strike Iran's nuclear facilities has hung over the Middle East for 20 years. Israeli officials have periodically warned that they would not allow Iran to cross the nuclear threshold, regardless of what the Americans or Europeans preferred. Military analysts debate whether Israeli air power, even with American weapons, could destroy enough of Iran's deeply buried, geographically dispersed program to genuinely set it back, rather than simply triggering escalation. The consensus: a strike could delay, it cannot destroy. And delay, in this context, might only harden the Iranian resolve to reach the finish line before the next strike comes.
The most optimistic scenario: a new comprehensive agreement is negotiated. It covers not just the nuclear file, but also ballistic missiles and regional behavior. Iran accepts tougher verification. The West accepts Iran's right to civilian nuclear power. Sanctions are lifted incrementally, tied to verified compliance. For this scenario to occur, several near-impossible things must happen simultaneously. Iran must believe America will keep its word this time. America must believe Iran is negotiating in good faith. The Israeli government must accept a deal it considers insufficient. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states must not feel abandoned. The IRGC must agree that the deal serves their interests. It has happened before. It could happen again. The probability in the current environment? Low, but not zero. Scenario 2. Managed ambiguity. The second scenario, and arguably the most likely in the short to medium term, is that nothing dramatic changes. Iran continues enriching at high levels, but stops short of weaponization. The IAEA continues to monitor what it can. Western governments continue to impose and periodically tighten sanctions. The situation stabilizes into a permanent, uncomfortable gray zone. This is, in some ways, the status quo stretched indefinitely. It is unsatisfying, dangerous, and unstable, but it avoids war. Several states in the region would find this intolerable. Saudi Arabia has already signaled interest in acquiring its own nuclear capabilities if Iran crosses the threshold. The proliferation risk is real. Managed ambiguity is not a solution. It is a postponement. Scenario 3. Iran goes nuclear. The scenario that Western governments most fear and have worked for 30 years to prevent. Iran conducts a nuclear test or simply announces that it possesses nuclear weapons, choosing the North Korean model. Fait accompli. The strategic logic would be identical to every other nuclear state's reasoning. The weapon exists to guarantee regime survival, not to be used. Iran's leaders have watched what happened to Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who gave up his weapons of mass destruction program in 2003 and was subsequently overthrown and killed in 2011. The lesson drawn in Tehran was unambiguous. A nuclear Iran would trigger a regional arms race. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, all have publicly suggested they would pursue their own capabilities. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, already weakened, could functionally collapse. Scenario 4. Military strike. An American or Israeli military strike, or both, on Iran's nuclear facilities. The option that has been on the table for 20 years. The option that has repeatedly been taken to the edge and then stepped back from. The arguments for: it destroys, or at minimum severely damages, the infrastructure Iran has spent decades building. It buys time, years, perhaps a decade. The arguments against: Iran's facilities are deep, dispersed, and hardened. A strike that doesn't destroy the program only teaches Iran that it needs the weapon faster, not slower. Iran would retaliate, closing the Strait of Hormuz, flooding regional proxies with weapons and orders, striking American bases across the region. The global economic consequences of a closed Hormuz Strait, through which 20% of the world's oil passes, would be catastrophic and immediate. And then what? You have had a war. Iran still wants the weapon. Iran now has a legitimate grievance and the sympathy of the non-Western world. You have not solved the problem. You have exploded it. Scenario 5. Internal change. The long game scenario. The one that no government wants to depend on because it has no timetable. Iran's population is young, educated, and deeply frustrated with the Islamic Republic. The 2022 protests showed the depth of the fracture between the regime and its people. Iran has one of the highest rates of brain drain in the world. Its best and brightest leave because the country offers them no future. At some point, the argument runs: the Islamic Republic will either reform fundamentally or collapse. A post-revolutionary Iran, whatever it looks like, would have different priorities, different relationships with the outside world, and potentially no interest in the enormous cost and risk of a nuclear weapons program. History has seen it happen. It happened in South Africa. It happened in Ukraine. It happened partially in Libya before the end came differently than anyone planned. This scenario requires that the world avoid catastrophic war in the meantime. It is a scenario measured in decades, not negotiations.
The JCPOA was a remarkable diplomatic achievement. It was also structurally fragile in a way that its architects understood but could not fully solve. Nuclear agreements require trust, not warmth, not friendship, but a basic belief that the other party will remain bound by what they have signed. The JCPOA tried to substitute verification for trust. If you can see what they are doing, you do not need to trust them. But verification requires the participation of the party being verified. And the party being verified must believe that compliance pays, that the benefits of staying in the deal outweigh the benefits of leaving. When America left in 2018 and Iran received nothing it was promised, that calculation was shattered. Future Iranian negotiators, whatever government they represent, will begin from the assumption that any agreement with the United States has a 4-year expiry date attached to it. This is the deepest wound that the Trump withdrawal inflicted, not the specific nuclear metrics, which can be renegotiated, but the credibility of American commitments, which cannot simply be restored by signing a new piece of paper. A genuine diplomatic solution, one that is durable, verifiable, and politically sustainable, would require several things that no current party has demonstrated the ability or willingness to provide. It would require the United States to make commitments in forms that survive changes of administration. It would require Iran to accept limits on capabilities it has spent decades and enormous treasure building. It would require Israel to accept that a diplomatic solution, however imperfect, is preferable to a military one. It would require Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to believe that Iran integrated into the international order is less threatening than Iran isolated and resentful. And it would require that someone, somewhere, is willing to offer Iran something it actually values enough to accept constraints in return. None of these things are impossible. Each of them, taken alone, has happened before. Together, in the current environment, that is a different question. Is there any diplomatic solution left? The answer is yes. There is always a diplomatic solution,
as long as there are human beings on both sides who prefer negotiation to catastrophe. The JCPOA proved that Iran would accept constraints on its nuclear program in exchange for economic relief and international legitimacy. That is the foundation of every possible deal. It has not disappeared. But the architecture that would make such a deal credible, a United States that keeps its commitments, a verification regime Iran accepts, a regional environment that does not blow up the negotiating table every few years, does not currently exist. What exists instead is a nuclear threshold state with the fastest growing stockpile of enriched uranium it has ever possessed. Surrounded by adversaries with military options they are increasingly willing to contemplate. Inside a region that has just been through the most violent 18 months in decades. History does not end. The story of Iran's nuclear program is not a story with a fixed conclusion. Not the bomb, not a deal, not a strike. It is a story still being written by governments and generals and diplomats and, ultimately, by the people of Iran themselves. The deal is not dead, but it is on life support, and the machine running it is running out of time.